Found out my husband Ron had racked up huge debts and was lying to his rich family, saying I was the one in debt. When his sister accused me of baby trapping him after I got pregnant, I was shocked. My husband Ron, who's 34, and I, at 28, are going through a major crisis, and I need to know if what I'm planning to do is right. For some context, I met Ron 4 years ago. I still remember the day like it was yesterday. I used to hit up this coffee shop all the time, and I guess he must have spotted me because one morning he walked right up and asked for my number. Ron's a total looker and seemed like he was into finance, so I didn't think twice before handing over my digits. He called me, we chatted, and decided to go on a date. Right off the bat, Ron was super open about his family's wealth. He told me his dad busted his butt to become a top real estate agent and provide them with a luxurious life. He asked about my family, and I told him I came from a lower-income background but had worked my tail off to become an accountant. I was pulling in a good salary and was totally self-sufficient, which was a huge deal for someone like me. At first, everything between Ron and me seemed perfect. He'd take me out to fancy dinners, shower me with pricey gifts, and go on and on about his family's wealth. He lived in this massive mansion, drove luxury cars, and wore designer clothes like it was nothing. Coming from humble beginnings myself, I have to admit, I was blown away by his lifestyle and felt a bit out of place. I told him he was free to find someone more on his level, but despite our different backgrounds, Ron and I really connected on a deeper level. I had a steady job I was proud of, and he respected my drive and work ethic. When I met Ron's family for the first time, I couldn't help but pick up on the arrogance that seemed to hang around them. Their mansion was like something out of a magazine, filled with expensive art and lavish decor. But honestly, what got to me the most was how cold and distant they acted towards me right from the get-go. His mom wouldn't even shake my hand and totally ignored me. It was like she instantly thought I was just after Ron's money, and she made sure I knew it with her attitude and all these questions about where I came from. His parents were grilling me about my upbringing, education, and job, like they were trying to figure out if I was good enough for Ron. His older sister kept pressing if I really just bumped into Ron at that coffee shop or if it was some big scheme to meet him. No matter how many times Ron and I explained that he actually asked me out and I had no clue who he was, she wouldn't buy it, insisting everyone knows who they are. To be honest, I genuinely had never heard of them or seen them before because I didn't grow up in a fancy neighborhood. Despite their digs and snide remarks, I kept my cool and didn't say anything back. At the end of the meeting, his dad did say that I seemed like a hard worker, but he'd always hoped his son would marry someone richer than him. That really got under my skin because I've never asked Ron to support me, and it's not my fault where I came from. All those challenges made me the strong, independent person I am today, and I'm not ashamed of that. After that meeting, I told Ron I was done meeting his parents, and he'd be going to see his family alone next time because I wasn't going to put up with that kind of scrutiny again. He tried to argue, but I stood my ground and told him how humiliating it was. I also reminded him that my parents never treated him like that, so his parents had no right to be so cold and unwelcoming to me. In the end, he agreed, and since then he's always gone to meet his family all on his own. But despite what his family thought, our relationship kept growing, and before long we were talking about moving in together. I have to say, this was totally Ron's idea. You see, my lease was about to renew, and I was looking for a bigger spot for me and my dog when Ron suggested it'd be better if we moved in with him. We had been dating for 10 months by then, so I was a bit hesitant. But he tried to reason with me, saying he could see himself spending the rest of his life with me, and moving in was the next logical step in our relationship. I took a few days to think it over, but in the end I agreed. His house, which his dad bought, was really grand, but it always felt a bit too cold to me. You know, like stepping into an interior design showroom where everything's curated but lacks the warmth of a lived-in home. I turned his cold, lifeless house into a home. He had agreed on splitting bills, and I didn't mind since I liked paying for my own stuff, and I wasn't paying any rent here anyway. I think this is when I started noticing his life more closely now that we were living together. Up until then, I was always dazzled by his charm and the luxurious lifestyle he projected. One of the first things that struck me was how empty his daily routine was. Although he worked in finance, he hardly ever went to his office except for 1 day a week. He told me his boss was his dad's friend, so he didn't have to go to the office every day, which I guess made sense. But instead of working a regular 9-5, he would easily get tired and irritated and go out shopping. I'd be at the office when he'd send me multiple pictures of him wearing different luxury brand shoes, asking me which one I liked the best. This happened at least 3 times a week, but it was his cash, so I kept my mouth shut. Every time he bought a new pair of shoes, he'd snap a bunch of pics, post them online, and then keep checking his phone to see if his buddies or followers were reacting to his posts. Ron had turned into a bit of an influencer because he was always posting about luxury stuff, so I guess that's why he was glued to his phone, chasing likes and comments. His online friends would sometimes hit him up for parties, but he never took me along and would come up with excuses like he couldn't bring a plus one or he just wanted to meet new people. Even then, I didn't say anything, even though it bugged me a bit. Then he went and bought a luxury sports car. I mean, who spends that much on just a car? While all this was going down, I noticed he had zero interest in paying any of our bills. He had agreed to split them, but he always ended up telling me to cover everything, including his phone and cable bills, which I didn't even use. If I ever mentioned it, he'd tell me that we're partners, and since he was letting me stay for free, I should pitch in more. Looking back, I don't think my problem was paying his bills. It was more of a gut feeling that something about him just felt off. If he was rich enough to buy luxury shoes, clothes, and cars, then why did he need help with bills? Sure, I was thankful I could live at his place without paying rent, but I wouldn't have minded paying rent and living on my own if it meant I was only paying my own bills. Unlike him, I had a set budget and wanted to save as much as I could to start a family one day. I felt like he should be doing the same because if that wasn't our goal, then I didn't want to be with him. I decided to have a serious talk with him and laid it all out there, telling him he could break up with me if we weren't on the same page. But he reassured me that he really wanted to start a family with me and thought I was a dependable woman. He also said he was going to stop blowing so much cash. I figured everything would be okay after that. But then, one weekend, while I was cleaning out his garage and he was off playing golf, I stumbled upon the truth that Ron had been putting up a front to everyone, including me. It turned out that most of the stuff he showed off was bought with debt and loans. His fancy car and designer clothes, all on credit. He had recent credit bills that he was supposed to pay but had skipped out on. I was totally shaken when I found these bills hidden in a shoe box. This meant he had been keeping this secret from me on purpose. I was pissed. I waited for him to come back from golfing with his buddies. When he walked in, he saw me sitting there with all his bills spread out on the table, and he totally freaked. He started yelling at me, asking why I went through his stuff, and I told him I knew everything and he couldn't hide it from me anymore. Ron tried to backtrack, saying these were just a few bills and he was working on paying them off. I asked him why he hadn't paid them already since he was supposedly bringing in money every month from his job. That's when Rob admitted he'd been out of a job for the last 4 months. I was completely shocked by this because he had been going into the office once a week like normal for the past 4 months, and on the other days, we'd text while I was at work and he was supposedly working from home. I asked him how this happened and why he never told me about it. Ron opened up about how his boss was a total jerk and had gone back on his word, pushing for Ron to come into the office every day since the company was taking on more clients, and Ron needed to have more face-to-face meetings. However, Ron felt it was disrespectful, and he and the boss had a disagreement which resulted in his boss firing him. Ron went on to tell me how it was no big deal and that he'd snag a job in no time once he started applying. My eyes widened in shock as I asked him what the heck he had been doing for the past 4 months if he hadn't even applied for a job yet. Ron replied that he was taking a break for his mental health and that I shouldn't blame him for any of this. I told him that even if he had lost his job, it didn't make sense why he couldn't pay his bills, especially since he supposedly came from a wealthy family. Ron told me how he did ask his parents for help, but they had refused to help him. He went off about how his parents clearly favored his older sister more and how unfair it was. I felt like my entire relationship with him had been a lie. The illusion he had portrayed of himself was starting to crumble. Clearly, he wasn't wealthy, and that's why he depended on me to pay his bills while his unemployed butt continued to buy luxury items and post about them on social media. I told him very firmly that I loved him, but that this was not something I signed up for. I told him that I knew exactly how it felt to be broke, and I had worked really hard to get out of it, so I was not going to let anyone drag me back down to that place ever again. I informed him that if he didn't agree to change his ways right that second and show me through actions, I would be out of his house with my stuff that very evening. I guess seeing me this pissed really got through to Ron. He immediately apologized to me and sat down to discuss ways to deal with his bills. I told him he had to sell his car, pay off his credit card bills, and stop buying fancy stuff for a while. Ben tried to argue, saying people would judge him and his friends would tease him about it. I told him straight up that I didn't care about that because his debts were piling up and needed to be dealt with first. He asked if I could help him pay off some of the loan, but I said no way, that it was his responsibility and I'd be covering our bills and daily expenses. I made it clear that until he started taking steps to reduce his debt, I wasn't going to talk about our future together. Reluctantly, he agreed. Over the next few months, Ben started taking action to tackle his debts. We listed his car for sale, and since it was a sports car, we got lucky and sold it for enough to pay off his loan and have a bit left over for his other bills. Then, he cut back on unnecessary spending and focused on paying off his credit card bills. As you can imagine, it was tough for him because he's not used to holding back on anything. There were times he felt frustrated and doubtful, but I kept encouraging him to work hard and take control of his finances. Eventually, Ben managed to pay off a big chunk of his debt, and I was proud of him for trying. We talked about him getting a job, but that's when Ben shared his plan to start his own business. He told me he had an entrepreneurial spirit and wanted to give it a shot. I was totally against it because I'm much more cautious than Ron. I knew he could be pretty indecisive at times, and I wasn't sure if he had the drive to build a business. But since he'd worked hard to pay off his debt, I didn't put up much of a fight. During this time, Ron proposed to me, which totally caught me off guard. He told me how he had listened to all my demands and had paid off his debt, so now we could focus on starting a family together. I told him yes, because at the end of the day, I did love him, and all I wanted was for him to keep working hard just like I did so we could both build a life together. He did tell me that his parents had no idea he was going to propose, so he was kind of nervous about breaking the news to them. When he called to let his parents know, they told him that even though they were happy for him and would support him, they really didn't expect that he would end up with someone like me. On the other hand, my parents were thrilled for me. We had a small wedding because I didn't want to blow too much money and mess up our credit scores after Ron had just gotten out of debt. My parents were awesome and stepped in to help with the wedding costs, and I also chipped in from my savings to cover our wedding expenses. Ron's contributions, on the other hand, were pretty minimal, even though his family is supposedly loaded. When our guests were amazed at how classy the event was, some even assumed that Ron and his family had probably picked up the tab. Throughout all this, Ron stayed quiet, never correcting their assumptions or setting the record straight, and I couldn't help but feel a bit let down. It was pretty disappointing to see him soaking up the undeserved praise, especially knowing that he had been out of work for months and hadn't pitched in financially as much as you'd think. His parents also shamelessly never corrected anyone, and maybe it was out of guilt, but they decided to pay for our honeymoon. This was totally unexpected from them, but we took it because otherwise we might not have even gone on a honeymoon. After our wedding and honeymoon, Ron worked on starting his own social media agency, just like he had planned, where he would be working with brands and hearing influencers. This business could definitely make some serious cash, but there are tons of agencies out there, and it's tough to stand out. I'd come home to him griping about how he couldn't get an influencer for an event or how he lost one who wouldn't budge on their terms. Plus, brands rarely teamed up with new agencies, so it was a real struggle for him to get any to trust him enough to sign on. As a result, the business never brought in any money, and I'd sometimes beg him to go back to a regular 9-to-5 job, even if it wasn't as thrilling. Ron would get ticked off and tell me he needed time and that he was going to make it work. But no matter how many events he went to or influencers he met, his business just wasn't cutting it and was definitely not reliable. Meanwhile, I was getting fed up with being the only one bringing in the dough and working non-stop while I was awake. I'd come home and still have more work to do. The dishes were always dirty, the laundry was piling up, and the dog needed a walk. On top of all that, he'd wait for me to cook for him while complaining about all the bills that needed paying. If I ever mentioned anything about my job, he'd say how glad he was to have left his, since he didn't want to be as stressed out as me. This really got under my skin because I was the one paying for everything with my stressful job while he was out partying at events every day. I slowly started to resent him more and more. We do nothing but watch TV together, and it was starting to feel suffocating. On weekends, I'd sleep a lot because I was constantly burned out from working all week. If I ever asked him to help out with chores around the house, he'd tell me that starting a business took all his energy, and as his partner, I should be more understanding. Last month, on top of all this stress, I found out I was pregnant. I've always pictured myself pregnant and having a baby, but for some reason, this just didn't feel like the right way to start a family. I mean, when you're bringing a kid into the world, you want them to have a stable home with two parents who are both pulling their weight. But in our situation, I was the only one doing that, and he wasn't contributing anything to the household. If I had a baby, it would just mean piling more work on top of everything I'm already doing. So I decided to talk to him about it. Unlike me, Ben was over the moon and gave me a big hug. He said how amazing the news was and how he couldn't wait to be a dad. When I mentioned how tired I was around the house and how a baby would only add to my workload, he said he agreed and promised to start taking on more responsibilities. I was pretty surprised by how excited he was, and I was happy he was willing to step up. Over the past few weeks, Ron has been trying. I still handle 80% of the house stuff like cooking, cleaning, and laundry, but he's been doing the dishes, taking out the trash, and walking the dog. I figured with time we could keep improving. This past weekend, he told me he was going to see his family, so I said I'd come too since we wanted to announce the pregnancy together. I knew his parents might not be thrilled about the pregnancy, but when I told them, their faces just dropped. His mom and sister scoffed at me and shot me the nastiest looks, while his dad stared at the ground like I'd done something terrible. His mom looked me right in the eye and said it was ridiculous to bring a child into our marriage with all the problems we were having. I asked her what she meant, but she just ignored me and left the table. Ron and I decided to bounce because the vibe was totally ruined, and I had no clue why. On our way back, I asked him what his mom was going on about, but he just shook his head saying he had no idea, and then he suggested it would be better for him to keep meeting his family solo from now on since they were clearly getting under my skin. I was super ticked off and let down by him because I hadn't done a thing to deserve how his family was treating me, and with a baby on the way, I thought we could all just move past the old drama for the kid's sake. Yesterday, while I was at work, I got a call from my Sil. She'd never called me before unless it was something major, so I picked up right away, thinking maybe something had happened to my husband or their folks. In our chat, Sil told me she had talked with Ben, who felt they were all being pretty disrespectful to me, but she wanted to finally lay out exactly why they all felt this way. This is when she dropped the bomb that she knew we were struggling because of all the debts I supposedly had, and they didn't appreciate all the effort Ben was putting in for me when I was supposedly not contributing financially. I took a second to process the info and then asked her to spell out exactly what she meant, because I was totally confused by what she was hinting at. Sil then explained that Ben had told them I had massive debts, and he was the one who had to cover everything by selling his car, and he even sacrificed not buying luxury brands. My head was spinning as she went on to say she couldn't let her brother suffer anymore and that I shouldn't baby trap him. I can't even begin to tell you how furious I felt at that moment. This manchild had gone and spun a web of lies to his family about me being in debt just to save his own skin. He clearly didn't want people thinking he was broke, so he made up this messed up story where he could pin it all on me. I was working my butt off day and night at a job I hated just to keep the bills paid while he was out there spinning tailies. I was so mad that I didn't even want to get into it with his sister, so I just told her she was right and that I shouldn't baby trap him since he wasn't even good enough to be a dad. Then I hung up and told my boss I was sick so I could head home. I knew my husband was out schmoozing with some influencer, so I grabbed my stuff and my dog to move out. I didn't leave a note or anything, just packed my car and hit the road with everything I owned. Since yesterday, I've been crashing at my parents' place while Ron's been blowing up my phone. He must have talked to his sister because he's been texting me, saying he can explain it all and begging me to come back home. My parents don't know the whole story yet, but they can tell it's serious, so they're not grilling me about it. Honestly, I'm torn. On one hand, I'm pregnant and I want my kid to have a dad, but on the other, I don't want to be with someone who's been spreading lies about me when I've given him so much. Am I wrong for thinking about divorcing my husband after what my sister-in-law told me? Update 1, I spilled everything to my parents, and they're on the same page as everyone on Reddit, saying I need to leave my husband. What he's done is just unforgivable. He went to such extremes to lie about me over the years, even though I've been nothing but a good and loyal partner to him. The nerve he had to say it was my debt shows I can't trust him. I'm planning on talking to him and letting him know I want a divorce. Update 2, it's been a week since my last update. I finally talked to my husband 2 days ago. He'd been calling and texting me nonstop for days. He got in touch with my parents who told him I was staying with them, but they didn't spill any more beans. He came over to my parents' place yesterday so we could talk. He was clearly shaken up and straight up started apologizing. I asked him if he even knew what he was apologizing for, and he nodded, telling me how after I had left, he had called everyone and his sister had informed him that she had talked to me, so then he had pieced it together. I asked him why he would make such atrocious lies about me, and how insulted I felt when his sister called to tell me that I was baby trapping him. He nodded remorsefully and went on to tell me how he has always felt insecure around his family members. He told me that all his parents cared about was their wealth and status, so he was too embarrassed to tell anyone the truth. He went on to tell me how when his family inquired about where his car was, it was just easier for him to blame me and tell them a story about how I was in debt, and he was helping me out rather than owning up to his mistakes. He told me that he never thought it would be a big deal since I wasn't close to his family anyway. I shook my head in disappointment and let him know that I had no idea that he could be this disgusting and manipulative. I reminded him how much I had worked all these years to provide for us, yet here he was admitting shamelessly how easily he had betrayed me. I told him that I was divorcing him. Hearing this, he started to plead with me not to do this, telling me how we should think about the baby, but I told him that we didn't have to be married to co-parent our child. I pointed out to him that the child would be much happier growing up in a stable environment, free from this tension and discord in our relationship. Despite his pleas, I stayed firm in my decision to end the marriage. Clearly, we had reached a point where staying together was no longer healthy for either of us. The thought of putting my kid through a chaotic home full of fights and bitterness is something I just can't do. He begged a bit more but had to leave when he saw I wasn't budging. He tried to say sorry to my parents before he left, but they just looked at him all disappointed and didn't say anything back. A lot of you suggested I should reach out to his family and set the record straight. I don't want to see them, but I do think it's right to tell them the truth once and for all. So yesterday, I sat down and wrote a long email to his parents and sister, laying out every single thing I've ever paid for Ron, with screenshots of my bank statements. I wrote about how he was the one drowning in debt with bills piling up, yet he kept buying one luxury item after another. I let them know I didn't want anything from them, and that Ben was free to walk away from my child if that's what he wanted, but he'd still have to pay child support every month. I told them about my decision to divorce Ben and how they could finally get their wish and marry him off to some rich woman. Since my email, Ben has been texting me nonstop because his parents and sister are all over him for lying about me. They've even called me, but I haven't picked up. His sister sent me a text apologizing for what she said and is begging me not to leave the family. Honestly, I don't care about their apologies or their opinions anymore. I've already decided to go through with the divorce, so I'll be meeting with a divorce lawyer next week. As for my pregnancy, I'm determined to give my baby a stable and loving home, even if it means co-parenting with Ron separately. I've got my family's support, and I'm sure I can handle whatever comes my way as a single parent. Thanks to everyone who's given me advice and support during this tough time. This is gonna be my final update because I want to focus on myself and my baby.